Welcome to the Ready First podcast series. I am Captain Coulter from 1st Battalion, 36th Infantry Regiment, and I will facilitate this podcast with First Lieutenant Garcia. In today's podcast, we will discuss urban operations. So to start us out, Lieutenant Garcia, what are urban operations?
Well, sir, urban operations are those operations across the range of military operations planned and conducted on or against objectives on a topographical complex and its adjacent natural terrain, where many man-made construction or the density of population are the dominant features. In other words, many of the same principles of warfare apply, but the biggest difference is in urban operations is the density of terrain and population that you find in cities.
Okay, great. So before we dive into our discussion, let's start with the doctrinal overview. Our two primary references that we are taking from today are ATP 3-06, Urban Operations, and ATTP 3-06.11, Combined Arms Operations in Urban Terrain. These both provide commanders and staff specific information that they will need to plan and conduct urban operations from the BCT level all the way down to the individual soldier, as well as templates and examples of products that are routinely used in the conduct of urban operations. Let's start with defining an urban environment. Lieutenant Garcia, what can you tell us about an urban environment that is different from a conventional battlefield?
Sure, like regular operations, defining the urban environment is key to understanding the battlefield, identifying advantages and disadvantages, and using those as a basis to begin your COA development. Defining the urban environment follows the same process as IPB, but there are some important considerations that should be focused on, such as terrain, population, and infrastructure.
Okay, so let's start with terrain. What are some aspects of terrain that we should focus on?
Sir, so you're going to want to focus on spaces and surfaces, patterns, and areas.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about what spaces and surfaces are.
Well, sir, commanders in other environments address the depth, breadth, and height of the area of operation in terms of airspace and surface. Urban operations, you also expand this to maritime space, so like a coastline, lakes, rivers, airspace, surface like the ground level, highways, streets, or parks, or super surface, tops of buildings, multi-story building, and then subsurface, which would be underground.
Okay, so moving on to population, what areas should we focus on there?
Well, sir, for population, it's broken down into groups, beliefs, needs, agendas, leadership and organization, size, location, and support.
Okay, so tell me why size is important when it comes to urban terrain.
Sir, so population does not necessarily equate to the amount of a city's physical space. Some cities can have a bunch of people jammed into a really small area. As urban areas expand, urban patterns begin to blur and social complexities increase.
Okay, finally, let's move on to infrastructure. What aspects of infrastructure are different about the urban environment?
So, sir, infrastructure is broken down into economics and commerce, administration and human services, energy, cultural, communications and information, and transportation and distribution.
Okay, tell me about the cultural aspect of infrastructure.
Cultural encompasses many organizations and structures that provide the urban populace with its social identity and reflect its culture to include religious organizations, places of worship, schools, libraries, museums, archaeological sites, or historical monuments.
Okay, great. So we'll make sure to keep all those considerations in mind as we move forward. Moving on to the next topic, we're going to talk about the urban operational construct described in ATTP 3-06.11. This construct consists of understanding, shaping, engaging, consolidation, and transition. This construct is not necessarily sequential, nor is it a planner's tool for phasing an operation. It enables the commander to understand, visualize, describe, and direct the staff processes and the conduct of an urban operation. Lieutenant Garcia, go ahead and describe each one of those aspects of the urban operational construct.
Sir, so for understand, that's something that you do in any military operation. This requires a continuous assessment of the current situation and operational progress, and then the ability to continuously learn about the urban environment. For shaping, is basically anything that sets conditions. Examples can include actions taken to achieve or prevent isolation, understanding the environment, and developing cooperative relationships with the urban populace. For engage, this can be gain and maintain contact with the threat and the population at the same time. This can range from overwhelming and precise application of combat power to large-scale humanitarian operation. For consolidate, consolidate to protect and strengthen initial gains and ensure retention of the initiative. That includes actions to eliminate or neutralize, isolate, or bypass enemy forces, sustainment operations, repositioning and reorganizing of maneuver, reconnaissance, security forces, or reallocation of displaced civilians, or reestablishment of law and order, and the restoration of key urban infrastructure. And then, sir, for transition, transitions occur in all operations, but in urban operations they occur at a greater frequency and intensity and are often more complex and often involve agencies other than the United States military.
Okay, thank you. So next we're going to talk about what ATP 3-06 describes as the fundamental tasks of urban operations. These are tasks that need to be considered at all times. They are: maintain a close combat capability, avoid the attrition approach, control the essential, minimize collateral damage, separate non-combatants from combatants, preserve critical infrastructure, restore essential services, understand the human dimension, create a collaborative information environment, and transition. So let's dive into a few of these. What does control the essential mean?
Oh, sir, control the essential is many urban areas are too large to completely occupy effectively unless you have a massive military force. So you really need to focus on the key terrain and what you actually need to control in order to accomplish your mission.
Okay. Now, why is minimizing collateral damage important?
So, sir, for forces integrate precision fires into operations and non-lethal tactical systems consistent with mission accomplishment. Commanders implement and follow rules of engagement for each urban operation, and commanders need to continuously assess the short and long-term effects of their urban operation and firepower on the population, infrastructure, and subsequent missions for the strategic objective.
Okay. And then finally, why do we need to separate non-combatants from combatants?
So this needs to occur psychologically and physically. Physically, it's pretty self-explanatory, but psychologically, you need to make sure that you're not lumping the civilian population in with the combatants.
Right. Okay. Next, we're going to go ahead and move to planning considerations, which we're going to break down by warfighting function. So starting with movement and maneuver, important things to consider during urban operations are canalization and compartmentalization of forces, increased civilian vehicle traffic and congestions within the city, and increased vulnerability due to explosive devices and the three-dimensional urban terrain characteristics. For intelligence, we have to focus on degraded recon and surveillance capabilities, degraded sensor capabilities. We have to have a complex and detailed IPB process, and an increased importance of credible human intelligence, including the contributions of local civilian liaisons and an established intelligence reach capability. For fires, we should consider masking and dead space, acquisition, indirect fires, and positioning of artillery. For sustainment, logistical requirements in urban operations are sustainment intensive, demanding resources for both military and non-combatants. Considerations include maintenance, blocked routes due to rubble, and degraded lines of communication. For command and control, the principle of unity of command remains essential to urban operations. Often units are required to operate non-contiguously, which stresses command networks and resupply. Urban operations often require subordinates to work innovatively and independently according to orders, intent, and ROE. For protection, properly positioned forces can take advantage of increased survivability within cities. Protection may have to extend to non-combatants, as enemy forces may seek to encourage discord and chaos, undermining the confidence and trust in U.S. or multinational forces. Now, Lieutenant Garcia, to fully understand why these planning considerations are important, we're going to go through some historical examples of urban operations. The first battle we'll talk about is the Battle of Stalingrad, which took place from August 1942 to February 1943. Germany and its allies fought the Soviet Union for control of the city of Stalingrad in southern Russia. Marked by fierce close-quarters combat and direct assaults on civilians and air raids, it is one of the bloodiest battles in the history of warfare, with an estimated 2 million total casualties. Lieutenant Garcia, starting with movement and maneuver, what lessons can we take from the Battle of Stalingrad?
Well, sir, the initial German bombardment of the city created a nightmare for tracked vehicles. The tanks of that time period were not designed for going through rubble, and the close-in nature of the urban landscape was not conducive to the German tanks. Additionally, the German tanks fought in mass and could not do so in the closed-in city environment. So the tanks, therefore, would not be able to effectively maneuver through the streets, nor would they be able to support the infantry maneuver as effectively. And the Soviets essentially canalized the German army within the city.
Right, so it's important to think about movement and maneuver and how to canalize enemy forces or to prevent canalization by the enemy. Next, let's move on to an example from fire's perspective.
Well, sir, the Germans were unable to mass fires on Soviet soldiers during Soviet attacks because the Soviet soldiers would get too close to the German soldiers. Therefore, the German army was unable to fight in the same manner they had become accustomed to for fear of hitting their own soldiers.
Okay, so that shows the importance of integrating indirect fires into your planning and ensuring that the considerations of the terrain are taken into account. Finally, let's look at a sustainment example.
So, sir, the Russians controlled major logistical routes in and around the city and gave them the ability to flood the city with soldiers and inhibit the German army's ability to evacuate the casualties, get ammunition and other critical supplies. Therefore, the German army had no real reinforcements and ran out of ammunition eventually. Logistical requirements in urban operation are sustainment intensive and demand resources for both military and non-combatants. The German army was so undermanned and unable to even sustain itself, let alone the thousands of civilians that fled the city daily.
Right, so that shows that it's definitely critical to plan for sustainment, resupply, etc., and keep those lines of communication open in an urban environment. Next, we're going to talk about the Battle of Hue, which took place from January 1968 to March 1968. It was a major military engagement in the Tet Offensive launched by North Vietnam and the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. After initially losing control of most of Hue and its surroundings, the combined South Vietnamese and American forces gradually recaptured the city over 1 month of intense fighting. Looking at intelligence, what can we learn from the Battle of Hue?
Well, sir, initial analysis of the NVA and Viet Cong seizure of the city caused multiple U.S. units to be sent to fight vastly numerically superior forces. This is an example of how complex the intelligence portion of urban operations is. The U.S. clearly did not have a large enough established intelligence reach capability. Inversely, the NVA were highly successful at sneaking divisions of soldiers and equipment into South Vietnam prior to the Tet Offensive. Also, poor maps complicated the U.S. forces attack. Maps at that time did not contain city details to the level to have a successful offensive urban operation. Therefore, the Marines would have no idea the size of the buildings they were attacking, nor would they know how defensible those buildings were once those buildings were seized.
Right, I think those are good examples. The first one especially is a good example of the understanding part of the urban operational construct. You have to understand the enemy and the environment. And then the second is a good example of conducting a detailed IPB process when conducting urban operations. The last battle we're going to talk about is the Battle of Grozny, which was the Russian army's invasion and subsequent conquest of the Chechen capital Grozny during the early months of the First Chechen War. The attack lasted from December 1994 to February 1995, resulting in the military occupation of the city by the Russian army. However, the initial assault resulted in very high Russian army casualties and an almost complete breakdown of morale in the Russian forces. It took them another 2 months of heavy fighting and a change in their tactics before they were able to capture Grozny. Lieutenant Garcia, looking at command and control, what can we learn from this battle?
Well, sir, the Russians' initial attack into Grozny was poorly coordinated and lacked proper control. The Russian subordinate commanders did not fully understand the situation or the intent, and therefore did not synchronize their initial movement into the city, leading even one unit being ambushed with absolutely no support. Inversely, the Chechens had strong communication with one handheld Motorola for every 6 combatants. And although it wasn't secure, the superior communications helped them act independently and innovatively to quickly adapt their plans based on the Russians' movements.
Right, so I think those are some good examples of why it's important to maintain control throughout the battle and to ensure that subordinate commanders understand the intent so that they can act independently if necessary during a battle. Next, let's look at an example of protection from this battle.
Well, sir, the Chechens developed a TTP in which they primarily utilized the bottom floor of buildings in order to limit casualties from indirect fire. While operating in an urban environment, forces should take advantage of increased survivability. Even though the Chechens were badly outmanned and out-equipped, the city offered them unique advantages: the familiarity with the terrain, the element of surprise, and the use of nonlinear and asymmetrical tactics, among others.
Right, so urban terrain definitely provides unique advantages and disadvantages when it comes to protection, and so that's why it's important to define the environment and plan for protection. Thank you for that excellent discussion. Before we conclude, do you have any recommended books or articles for someone that wants to learn more about urban operations?
Yes, sir. So I would recommend the Battle of Hue, Tet 1968 by Keith Nolan, an account of not only U.S. Marine operations in Hue, but also actions by the South Vietnamese Army and Marines who participated in retaking the city. Phase Line Green, the Battle of Hue 1968 by Nicholas War, a first-hand account by a platoon commander from one of the Marine units that was charged with retaking the city. Block by Block, The Challenges of Urban Operations by William G. Robertson, which is multiple vignettes of significant urban conflicts across modern history. House to House, The Memoirs of War by Staff Sergeant David Bellavia, which is an account of an Army infantry platoon leader fighting in the Second Battle of Fallujah. And then Cities Under Siege by Stephen Graham, an examination of the transformation of Western armies into high-tech urban counterinsurgency forces.
Okay, that concludes today's podcast. I hope you have all gained a little bit better understanding of what urban operations are, how to understand them, and how we can plan for them. Thank you.